The theme of this talk is happy, healthy, and ethical, using online research for positive outcomes. It's actually a very exciting set of talks, and we're really looking forward to them. At its core, behavioral research often seeks to improve the world by solving some social problem or contributing to basic human knowledge. And the talks in the study really address that. The first talk is going to be given by Koa Lewin from Weight Watchers, and he'll describe how positivity can nudge consumers toward healthy behaviors in an online weight loss community. Then Tim Silva from Bank of the West will talk about which kinds of messages lead people to join an environmentally sustainable bank. And then Aaron Moss from CloudResearch will address some issues of ethical treatments of participants on Mechanical Turk, and we'll address the question of whether it's ethical to use Mechanical Turk. So we'll start with Koa.
So just a quick introductions about me. I recently completed my PhD in social psychology at UNC Chapel Hill. I study positive emotions, human connections, and well-being. And I also work as a behavioral science researcher at WW, formerly known as Weight Watcher. So WW has a dedicated science team that works on how to promote health behaviors and wellness outcomes. And they did a lot of great research. They published over 125 peer-reviewed studies, 35 of which are randomized controlled trials. So today I'm going to present one of the collaborative projects between academia and industry that I did while I was at WW. So I'd like you guys to think of the last time when you had a positive moment of connection with someone. Did you share pleasant feelings through smile or laughter? Did you show mutual care for one another through like non-verbal behaviors? Did you feel in sync and on the same page, on the same wavelength with the other person? So if you did, you might have experienced a moment of positivity resonance, or POSRES. So according to the positivity resonance theory of co-experienced positive affect, POSRES is a momentary interpersonal experience during social interactions when people have shared positive feelings. As you see in the first pictures, they synchronize their nonverbal behavior that communicate mutual care, such as mutual laughter, mutual gaze, and their biological indicators sort of come into sync. So these three components of experience sort of co-occur in a holistic manner during an experience of positivity resonance between people. So the research presented here focuses on the self-report of perceived POSRES, which is short for positivity resonance, that centers around the first two components, which is shared positive affect between people and carrying nonverbal synchrony between people. And the research I present here answer two questions. First is, what are the precursors for this experience of connections? And second, what are the outcomes, specifically social outcomes of POSRES? So there are two preconditions theorized for moments of POSRES to emerge. The first one is real-time sensory connections. For example, seeing, feeling, hearing each other. And real-time sensory connection via in-person interactions would allow people to instantaneously send, receive, and thus coordinate verbal and nonverbal behaviors to form a synchronous connection, which is really important for the experience of POSRES. The second theorized precondition for POSRES is perceived safety. When one perceives a threat or a lack of safety, that triggers negative affect and diminishes positive affect, therefore inhibiting POSRES between people, which by definition involves shared positive affect between people. So once emerged, POSRES is theorized to momentarily broaden an individual's other focused thoughts and action tendencies. For example, it might temporarily increase feeling of togetherness increasing urges to be kind to others. And with regular occurrences, pause rest is theorized to build resources over time, such as biological resources linked to social connection, social resources such as pro-social tendencies, social bonds, belonging, social well-being. And these resources in turn might promote both individuals and groups' well-being and success. So at WW, we have an online weight loss community platform where members can interact with other members, like sharing about their progress, challenges, seek and provide support through posting and commenting. And we care about people's experience in our online weight loss community. So we ask the question, how does pause rest theory apply to online interactions? Since one important question is, since this online interaction in this social media platform is asynchronous, is primarily text and image based, and members communicate through posts and comments, we don't have a real-time sensory connections component to it. So one question is, do people perceive positivity resonance with other in an online asynchronous environment, and how? One hypothesis is perhaps on this asynchronous media, social cues such as a fast tempo of texting back and forth or messaging back and forth can still create a perceptions of being in sync among people. In other words, perception of quick mutual responding speed may be a distant proxy for continuous engagement and synchronous connection. Another question is, can pause rest theory be applied to real-world behavior to make an impact? Can pause rest promote connection to online community and health behavior? So this is where the research at WW and in industry in general is helpful, because with real-world behavioral data and good sample size, we are able to assess the real-world impact of theories. So our research questions are specifically regarding the antecedents of pause rest. We asked what factors contribute to perceived pause rest in an online weight loss community. Regarding the outcomes of pause rest, we asked, does pause rest build social resources? Specifically, does it promote feelings of connection to the community overall? And we also asked whether there's downstream effect or benefit of pause rest. So does connection to the community as the social resources promote program adherence and health behavior? To answer these questions, we sent a survey to about 28 to WW members, and there was 2,800 members participated. About 1/4 of them were current Connect users who have interacted with other people in the past 2 weeks. And members tend to be women, middle-aged, and white. So in order to assess pause rest, we use a self-reported measure. Typically, pause rest is measured with a 7-item scale, but here, to keep the survey short, pause rest was measured with a brief 2-item scale that has been highly correlated with the full scale. And we asked members to consider all their interactions on Connect. This is the name of the social media platform, with other users or members in the past 14 days. And we asked them what proportion of time during these interactions, from 0 to 100%, did they feel a mutual sense of warmth and concern toward other people, and did they feel in sync with others? And these 2 items were highly correlated with one another. So for the analysis, I divided the scores by 10 to reduce the scale discrepancies with other measures. So we measure pause rest of these participants for their interactions with others on Connect, but we also measure pause rest with other people in their life. So we obtain 2 different measures of pause rest, one on Connect and one in general. And what we find is members did perceive pause rest on Connect. So they reported feeling pause rest on an average 70% of the time during the interactions on Connect. And this was only slightly lower than the general level of pause rest that they reported for interactions with other people in their life. So what would create these online perceptions of pause rest? We test the two theorized factors that might give rise to pause rest from theory. The first one is feeling of safety. We use self-report measures, items such as I'm afraid to express my opinion. This is a reverse coded item. We also measure perceived mutual speed of responding by asking participants about whether they perceive that they respond quickly or out of respond quickly to their posts and messages. And we use perceived mutual speed of responding as the distant digital proxies for real-time connections. We also control for constructs in social psychology. For example, members perceive expectations or norms for social participations on the platform might influence their social interaction. So we also try to control for descriptive and injunctive social norm for social participations. So what we find is that, as predicted, feeling of safety and speed of responding would predict perceived pause rest, even after controlling for pro-social norms, and even after controlling for members' general tendency to perceive pause rest in interactions with other people in their life. So now we move on to outcomes. So what are the consequences of perceived moments of positivity resonance with other people on Connect? So we assess perceived social resources as an outcome of pause rest in the form of connection to the WW community with 3 indicators: feeling of belonging to the WW community, positive evaluations of the WW community, and identifications with this community. We also were interested in the downstream outcomes of social resource. So we asked whether these social resources would promote program adherence and health behavior. So we measure program adherence with an in-app food tracking measure. And we measure the number of days that participants track their food in the week after the survey. We selected food tracking because it is an important behavior that has been shown to predict weight loss success in the literature. So first, to quantify and measure connection to the WW community, I created a latent factors, consists of the 3 indicators: belonging, positive evaluations, and identifications with the WW community. So regarding outcomes, first, I found that for the Connect user that reported pause rest on Connect, I found that pause rest on the Connect platform predicted perceived connections to the community. Next, I found that for both groups, the Connect user and the non-user, feelings of connection to the community predicted future food tracking for both group of user. Finally, for the full mediation model, I wanted to test whether pause rest has an indirect effect on in-app food tracking through connection to the community. However, there were no significant indirect effect from pause rest to food tracking through connection to the WW community. So overall, these results hold when all of these patterns of findings hold regarding when control for positive affect, general tendency to experience pause rest, demographic factors, membership factors like membership length, current weight, etc. So one of the speculations we have for why we don't see an indirect effect from pause rest to in-app food tracking in the user group, which is the only group that provide pause rest data, is it might be due to a ceiling effect. So compared to the non-user of Connect, the Connect user reported greater feelings of connection to the community, and they also track food more frequently. So they have higher level of both of the outcomes. And this group of this sample also have lower variance for both of these outcomes. So this suggests that the Connect user also already have like really high level of these, so there might not be much variations, variability in these data to detect like a relationship of an indirect effect. So in summary, pause rest does exist on an asynchronous platform at a notable level, and perceived safety and perceived mutual speedy response predicted pause rest, even after controlling for general tendency to experience pause rest and community pro-social norms. We also find that pause rest predicted perceived social resources, that is connection to the community, and these social resources overall predicted program adherence or future food tracking. There's certainly limitation with this study, including use of self-report, correlational design, and sort of unrepresentative samples of mostly white female, which is the primary demographic of WW members. So what is the implications of this research? This research project conducted in an industry context has important outcomes. So first is support an existing basic theories in new contexts, right? So the factors that are important in real life are just as important in virtual settings. For example, feeling of safety predicted pause rest, interaction quality predicted social bonds and connection to the community, which in turn might be important for behavioral change. The result here is also help advance basic theory. Here we discover that in an asynchronous online environment, mutual speed of responding would predict the perception of pause rest. And this research also showed that basic theory can be applied to create greater impact, such as cultivating positive interactions online, building stronger community, and promoting healthy behavior. Thank you very much. I would like to thank my advisor and my collaborator. Please feel free to reach out to me for more positive connections and further discussions. Thank you. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure, and thank you for that. Do we have any questions? Does anybody have any questions? So I don't see any in the chat. So I was wondering about the this platform Connect. How is it? Do you use that often for research studies? Is it only something that Weight Watchers uses for research studies, or is this something that academic researchers like have access to? Is it like something that's
right,
specialized, proprietary to Weight Watchers?
Sure, I'm happy to provide more context. So it's the Connect platform is sort of like a social media platform that is member only. So people who are a member of WW app would have access to that platform. So it's kind of like a social media platform, and the way we collected data was through sending email survey to members and asking them about that experience. I think the folks at WW are very open to researcher collaborating with academic or industry researcher to do research projects. So I guess it's not like as open as Facebook, where where you can have a lot of access to like the informations on there. But yeah, but my the team at WW, they really value like collaboration with other researchers. So I think if anyone is interested in using utilizing their data to discover insight, I think they'll be very open to it.
And can you tell us a little bit about like what that platform is like in terms of like the demographics, how many people are on it, what kind of what typically goes on that platform?
So I don't have like a sort of a good I don't have information at hand right now about like the total like the total amount of numbers of members on that platform. And I think the demographic typically is similar to the demographic that I presented in the survey. So there's the majority of them are sort of middle-aged white women. WW start to like try to grow in like sort of attracting new members from other demographic. But traditionally it have been white middle-aged women, but it started to expanding, and their products right now are gearing toward like younger demographic and more diverse demographic. Like the total number of users. So I could give example of like different user groups on Connect. For example, they might have different interest groups like running, runners, people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and the membership in those groups would be like in the thousands and thousands of members. So like it might be like 50, 40, 50, 70, over 100,000 of members. So that is the knowledge that I have at hand right now, but I could look up more information about it.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so I think we're going to move on to the next talk.
I happen to be a social psychologist, and I study social identity theory. Yeah. So I am both the head of research and strategy for Bank of the West, which, if anyone is probably, well, most people are probably not familiar, but unless you're on the West Coast, Bank of the West was the original bank of San Jose. San Jose is the capital of Silicon Valley. Our bank was started in like 1870. So like, this is a very old institution. Bank of the West has the strongest environmental policies of any bank in the United States. And I didn't happen to know this when I was hired, but I remember within like, I think my first or second week, I met with like some of the heads of the marketing team, and they were talking to me about the bank and stuff. And I was like, oh, it sounds like you guys are becoming a social identity brand. And they're like, what is that? And I'm like, they had like no idea what I was talking about. But I was like, you accidentally hired a social identity theorist to head the research team. And so it just happened to be, I landed at this like amazing opportunity while I'm still finishing my PhD. And so I'm also a PhD student. I go to Claremont Graduate University down in Southern California. I work with Dr. Michael Hogg, who, for those who are or are not familiar, Dr. Mike Hogg is like one of like Mr. Social Identity Theory. Like he social identity goes Henry Tajfel and John Turner. They originally did all the papers. Michael Hogg was John Turner's one of his first PhD students. And so so he's been doing social identity work for his entire life. Anyways, and that will be what my talk is about, and about how that relates to banking. Let's see, screen number 1. All right. Oh man, I shouldn't have done that. How?
You can swap, yeah.
There we go. Yeah, sweet. Thanks for the heads up. Okay, so this is called Becoming an Environmental Social Identity Brand, How to Effectively Convey Your Values. So the thing that I probably most, this is the #1 question of what I work with at the bank. What motivates people to join environmental sustainable bank, right? What is it about? So in a sense, like the bank is banking our banking. Wow, that was no pun intended there. Our future as an institution on becoming the environmental bank in the United States, and having people be attracted to that as a value. But they're just like hoping this happens, right? And so a lot of the research that I do goes into what do we know about people's social identities around being green or being environmentally sustainable, and how do we develop communication with, like, say, within the marketing department to communicate that to the world outside of the bank, and then how do we develop better environmental experiences for our customers. We're working on things like building a carbon calculator and other sort of really cool stuff that we could talk about after the talk. So, little background. Social identity is a person's sense of who they are based in the groups they identify with, right? So we identify as our singular sense of self, right? Like, I'm Tim, I'm an extrovert, I like to go on walks, I enjoy fast cars and motorcycles. So I'm talking about who I am as an individual, right? But we also have these social identities, right? I'm also a scientist. I'm a proud banana slug, right? I went to UC Santa Cruz for undergrad. I'm a Californian. I'm proud to be born and raised in the Bay Area, and I'm a San Franciscan, right? So these are my social identities, right? And why do we identify as part of a social creature or part of social groups? Because it gives us a positive sense of who we are, right? It gives us a set of glasses, a framework to see the world around us. And one of these things that, like I mentioned, is that, you know, we're interested in looking at people's, you know, their green or their environmental identities. So in this first study, I'm going to go over two studies. In this specific study is like the part B of the two-part study. We collected 1,100 participants in this study, and we've done this like everyone else, you know, through CloudResearch. And we use CloudResearch very often for almost all of our research, especially the panels and stuff like that for very hard to reach populations. But this, we just use the regular CloudResearch platform into MTurk. And what we did was we created different versions of mock web pages in an experimental way to vary our messaging components in these very specific ways in which I'll get into. So we could study about how can we make our messaging most effectively using the lens of social identity theory to come up with messaging paradigms. So the first thing that I'll talk about is what's called meta contrast. So this is like the scientific way to say it, but basically this is the in-group, out-group effect. So when we think about, like, when I say I'm a Democrat, right, or I'm a Republican, I'm also saying I'm not the other group. I'm a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. When I'm a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, right? This is the in-group, out-group effect. And we tend to highlight this by making what our group is. We tend to tighten around our in-group. So when we say, like, we're Democrats, and we say, like, oh, we're all these things, and we make it psychologically, cognitively feels closer together. Like the differences between us, the variability within the group becomes shrunken down, and we maximize the difference between groups, right? So we're a really tight group. Those people are so far away from our attitudes and our beliefs, right? This is meta contrast, saying who you are in relation to who they are, right? Or the in-group, out-group effect. So in the study, in a previous study, we looked at talking about our environmental stance alone in contrast to the stance of other banks, their environmental stance. So in the previous study, the one right before this, we did this exact thing. And what we found was that when we talk about the bank's environmental values by ourselves, and I'll show you the page in a second, what does this look like? It worked well, but when we contrasted with those banks do, that's when it worked the best. In this study, we didn't find the same distance between those two things, and we'll talk about that in a second. But this is what it actually looks like, right? So on the left is the meta contrast condition, and on the right, there's no meta contrast in it. And I'll slide the page down, and we'll see what's going on. So you can see at the top of the page, it's going to be the same exact thing. And as the pages scroll down, you're going to see on the right, or on the left there, sorry, that is what they do, right? That's the out-group message, right? And right above that, you can see it on the right-hand side, it says at Mountain Bank. Oh, by the way, we changed it to Mountain Bank. So people might be biased to thinking about Bank of the West. So we just rebranded the the whole mock design so we could get away from people's prior conception of our bank, positive or negative. So you can see on the right, we're just at Mountain Bank, right? Who we are, like we the Democrats or we the Republicans. And then on the left with the meta contrast is who they are, right? Those top 6 US banks are the dirty dozen. And they are accounting for 37% of fossil fuel worldwide. And so as we scroll down the page, you'll see other elements are exactly the same, but the only things that are going to be different in this condition is the meta contrast versus no meta contrast. And again, in alignment with, right above it is our values, in alignment with their values is the meta contrast condition. And then you keep on scrolling, right? Same page all the way to the bottom, right? So we're just varying these very specific things within the study. In the previous study in which we just looked at meta contrast versus no meta contrast, we did find a significant effect of meta contrast producing on 2 different things that we measure is favorability and likelihood to open an account. Those conditions were significantly different from one another, and the effect was pretty substantial. But what it was kind of lacking in many ways was ecological validity. So there wasn't any product information about it. Like when you go to open to a bank account, or a bank's website, right, you expect to see stuff about the products, right? Like if you went to buy a car, you wouldn't just be like, oh, those car dealerships versus our car dealership, right? You'd expect to have stuff about cars. So in this secondary study, in this study here, we added information about products. And so we also wanted to compare our environmental messaging versus just having none of it at all, right? So that was another important thing. And then some people in the bank, and again, because doing research at a company is not like doing it in a lab, there are a lot of stakeholders, right? And so, I report directly to the chief digital officer, and I work directly with the chief marketing officer, and they have their ideas about what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, right? And so these are all considerations that, when I'm just working in lab, like in my PhD studies, like I don't have to worry about so much, except my advisor. But in the banking or in the business context, there's a lot of other things. So people wanted to add in other things like, well, what if we offer people $250 to open an account? How does that change everything, right? Because in their mind, which is also quite interesting, people have sort of naive or we could create attributions or why we think people are motivated. Like, if we give people money, right, that will get people to do things, right? And so we can actually go ahead and test these types of things. So we'll just go through this quickly. Offer and product only on the left, and the product only, right? You can just see it says get $250 when you open a deposit checking account, right? That's the only difference between the offer and the product only. And then the same elements going down the page, will be the same. So everything's being controlled in the same way. And this is, the product plus meta contrast and the offer product plus meta contrast. So again, what we already discussed in the previous thing, talking about who we are versus who they are. And on the right is having the product and the offer together versus just the product. By the way, how cool is this scroll effect, huh? This took me a long time to figure out, but it's pretty cool. So just in case anyone needs to do it, it's definitely doable. Blah, blah, blah. So what do we measure? So we measure in our studies how favorable do they feel towards Mountain Bank, and then they're interested in opening an account. The other thing that we measure at the beginning of the study is how much do they categorize themselves? We call them sustainability advocates, right? So going back to social identity theory, what's really important is to understand like how much do you vary in how much you categorize yourself as someone who's green, right? And that could be super strong on one end of the continuum, people who are like, they work at Greenpeace and stuff like that, right? To all the people who deny climate is changing and they work in the coal industry or something like that, right? You can imagine people's identities range on this sort of a thing. So get into the findings. So the meta contrast in this study, the meta contrast and the contrast and the no meta contrast conditions weren't statistically significant. So we collapsed across just to describe the data to our stakeholders. Also, one of the things to keep in mind is when we're working in industry, it's a lot more difficult in explaining complex, graphs and statistics to people who without sort of background and training in this way. So on the left, you can see the sustainability only condition, sustainability plus product, sustainability plus offer, and the product and offer only, right? You can see all of our sustainability messages is much better than just talking about the product and the offer only itself. And this is on a scale from 1 to 7. So the highest favorability on the 7-point scale. Now, when we get into interest in opening an account by condition, you can see these graphs come down, right? Which we expect. We're saying how favorable, and then how likely are you to actually engage in a particular way, right? People's interest in engaging in behavior is going to be a lot less. This is what we should always find in studies. But you can see our sustainability messages still improve over the product offer only landing page. So let's look at categorization. So you can see on the y-axis over there, that's favorability. On the x-axis is the self-categorization. And you can see there's that nice regression line going across, right? This is correlated at 0.3 for categorization or for favorability and self-categorization. And it's even more strongly correlated for interest in opening an account with self-categorization, right? So as people become, their identities are more green, those messages are making it more likely for them to be interested in opening an account, right? And when you get all the way over to that far right-hand side of the screen, right, people are, their score is like a 6 or a 7, you know, we're getting that high on the scale. So we broke this down just by categorization, by condition, and you can see, again, that same sort of effect from left to right. Same thing with interest in opening an account. And what's interesting on interest in opening an account, so those on the left side, the left graph over there, people are low in self-categorization, right? They're below that, meet that middle point on the graph, right? 4 is the midpoint of the graph, and everyone is below that, no matter what condition you are. But as you get to the right, people are getting more and more excited. So cool, study 1, pretty interesting. So jumping into study 2, we decided like, well, what else can we think about in persuading people, right? In how do we leverage what we know as social psychologists and implement it within in what we do to produce better, more stronger effects and strong effects to get people to increase favorability and likelihood to open an account. So in this study, same sort of design. We create more web pages and we change messaging. This study had 350 participants. And what we're looking at here is a couple different things. One is induced hypocrisy. So this is a technique of promoting desired behaviors by reminding someone of how they failed to uphold their beliefs in the past, right? So this creates a strong sense of dissonance. For those of you who don't know dissonance theory, Leon Festinger back in the 50s. Dissonance is when you hold a particular attitude and you have some behavior or something like this, right? I think I'm a good person. I cut off an old lady in traffic, right? These two things are not in alignment with each other. I think I'm a good person. I volunteer every Sunday. Those things are in alignment with one another. When you cut off an old lady in traffic and you think you're a good person, how do you deal with that gap, right? You're motivated. Dissonance theory is a theory of motivation. You have to reduce that you have to reduce that gap, and people typically do so by rationalizing and justifying their behaviors, right? Well, if she wasn't driving so slow, then I wouldn't have to cut her off in traffic, right? That's the rationalization. So anyways, we're using that as a technique to see about can we use that to increase persuasion. There's a couple different things here about social norms that we were interested in. So descriptive norms. So talking about the perception of how other people behave in a situation. And those are slightly different than injunctive norms. Injunctive norms is what is or is not acceptable. So what ought to be done? You should do this thing. You ought to do this thing. That's injunctive norms. This is what happens in society, in a situation. That's a descriptive norm. That's describing what's happening, right? Versus the ought or should. So in this study, we took a different web page. So this is something that we currently, I don't know if we still have it up online, but we wanted to see how could we create a better version of this web page, and by using the persuasive technique that I just described. So one of the things that I didn't know about before I worked at a bank, never really thought about it, but when you put your bank money into a bank, it doesn't just sit there, right? It like goes out into the world and funds things. And so like if you bank at, you know, Bank of America or Chase or whatever, like you fund the fracking industry, right? Like you fund offshore drilling, like this is what your money goes to, right? It goes out into the world and funds things. And so we're trying to communicate that like, hey, we don't do those things as an institution, right? When your money sits there or goes into the bank, like we go fund solar panels or we go fund whatever things. Like we don't go fund these things that are very harmful for the environment. How can we really amplify these messages? So we had 4 different conditions. Well, 3 experimental conditions, 1 control condition, which is the page we had. And you can see we have induced hypocrisy. So you can see the differences are just going to be in the bold there. So banks choose to finance whatever they want with your money without concern or care for your values, your choices, and their choices, and your choice in banks can seriously impact blah, blah, blah. So these are the different experimental conditions that we had. And what do we measure? Same thing, favorability, account opening, and how do people categorize themselves. So getting into the finding. So you can see the hypocrisy condition on the left is which we hypothesized would be the best. It actually looks exactly the same as the control condition. And so we were just like, oh man, what happened, you know? And then the injunctive norm and the hypocrisy plus adjunctive even worse than the control. Where it's like, oh man, we really messed this up. We couldn't figure it out. And so we try to like, well, what is the other, well, interest? Dang it. What the heck? Like, how did this, why? You know, as scientists, when you do something, you think it's going to work in a particular way, and then it just doesn't. You just go like, what the heck? Well, that's what happened in this study. But good thing we know about moderators, right? And mediators. So when you look at how favorability changes by how people self-categorize themselves. So you can see when people who are low in self-categorization, the graph on the left, that control condition is the best performing condition, right? So when people don't have any environmental identity, any green identity, or very low in it, the control condition works really great, right? But as you move from left on the screen to the middle and to the right, you can see how the hypocrisy condition really starts to pop, right? And why? Well, who cares? If you don't have a green identity, you're not going to feel hypocrisy, right? Like if you're like I'm a green person, I act sustainably in the world, and I like throw my trash on the ground, that's hypocrisy, right? But if you're like, I don't give a shit about the environment, I don't care about the environment, I throw my trash on the ground, well, there is no hypocrisy, right? And so that's why the condition on the left didn't pop, right? It's only for the condition on the right. It's only those people who have that green identity that they're like, oh my God, right? So the way in which they were dealing with this hypocrisy was to have higher and higher self-categories, or higher and higher favorability towards the bank. And the same thing happens for people's willingness to open an account. So when you look at people with low in self-categorization, right, their interest in opening an account is a 3.3 on a 7-point scale, but then it boosts up to a 5.6, right, for people who are high in self-categorization, which is a huge effect, right? So it's, yeah, anyway, so it was like, that's where we were like, oh man. And then we were like, oh, good. So we were pretty happy with the results, and what's cool about this is we can take this exact stuff and like actually implement it into the world and really make change, because, you know, we have like 2 million customers. So anyways, that's my talk. Oh, one other thing I wanted to discuss is that, I can't remember if it was this study or the study before, but we didn't hit the right button for, I forget what the Chris or Rachel, but when you have like your participants, like your trusted research participants, we didn't check that button, and the responses that we got back were horrible. One of the ways in which we on our team, we check to try to understand like who's taking our surveys and whatnot, and like what is the quality of their data, is we ask the scale question. So like favorability or likelihood to open an account. And then we have an open text box underneath that. And we said, what came to mind when you gave this response, right? So when we forgot to check the box and we looked at those responses, when the numbers were all weird, we just saw some was just like gobbledygook, right? It was just like, it was no words, or it was just nonsense words, right? But, and those were easy to spot. But as you started reading through it, you could see that the bots are getting really, really good, where they're able to take like contextual clues off the page and put it into an open field text box that sort of makes sense, right? If you're really not paying attention. But when we read back through the responses, you could see that they really weren't like, when I asked like, what came to mind when you're giving a response on favorability, it should be in the context of favorability or their likelihood to open an account. When you read a real human's response, they're like, well, I'm not really interested in opening a bank account, or I didn't know my money went to fund these things in the world. That's an important value to me, right? That's a human's response. A bot's response is just taking contextual things off the page or off the previous pages and putting something into a box. And so when we realized our mistake, we reran the study, checked the box, read through the comments afterwards. All humans, all make sense. So we were, yeah, it was a night and day thing. It was so useful and powerful for us to have that as an option when we do studies, because without a sense of trust in who is responding to our, to our work, to our research, then how do we trust the results, and how do we, let me see all your faces. How do we like effectively go to the boss and be like, yo, we should spend $1 million and do this thing, right? Based on this data that like maybe isn't reliable, right? Or maybe isn't trustworthy. And so it's like these types of things that CloudResearch offers is really, really valuable, not only for producing the type of like scientific papers that a lot of people, and we were just discussing before my talk, but also about like how do businesses make decisions that are going to spend a lot of money, and that could be wasted effort. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Tim, so we've made that now the default selection, so you can't make that mistake again. You actually have to turn off our quality control and sort of turning it on. So now everyone's protected.
Yay.
So with that, any other questions for Tim? That great presentation.
Yeah, that was a really great talk. Super interesting. I was interested, I know you just used this as an example, we were talking about like Democrats, Republicans as like a social identity, but sort of like attitudes towards the environment do tend to correlate with political party. And I was just, this maybe is like a little more broad than what your work was on, but like, is the Bank of the West strategy just be like, we mostly care about trying to get Democrats to like join the bank, and just like, we don't really care about whether Republicans want to join. That's like kind of a crude way of saying it, but is it like, yeah, I guess like, do you have thoughts on that?
Totally. So I have data. Here is on the left, our measure of self-categorization predicting interest in opening an account. And on the right is political affiliation predicting interest in opening an account.
Wow.
3 times worse at predicting than measuring a psychological construct that's meaningful in how people, how they categorize themselves, right? So if the environment is important to you and we're measuring your environmental identity, that's going to be a much stronger predictor, because the variability across a grouping like that is going to be a lot less, right? Like what it means, there's going to be lots of Republicans who are cool with the environment, right? Like I think many times stereotype as Republicans as not being and caring about the environment, right? Like if you're a farmer and you're super conservative and you have no more water because you live in California, well, the environment is super important to you, isn't it, right? So anyway, so here's this data to back up that point, because your point is exactly the point of everyone in the bank, right? Like people who we're talking to, they're like, well, why are we doing this? Oh, you can't see my face anymore, but no, there we go. They were like, well, we should just not go after Republicans, and that's why we collected this data. And I was like, no, we need to go after people who have this as an identity, as an element of their identity, about their green identity, not specifically about like, oh, we shouldn't market to people in North Dakota, right? Because it's just a conservative area, right? So anyways, that was cool. I had that data.
That's super cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's great.
Hi, Tim. I love the being able to slide through the screens. That was excellent. I will need to learn how to do that in future presentations. Did you have a slide on demographics? Did I miss that? I could have.
Oh, yeah, probably. I mean, I had a lot of stuff to share, and
I was just curious, like, where did all your participants stem from?
yeah. So it's
Okay.
like the standard MTurk stuff you're gonna get, right? So, breakdowns, marital status, gender, age range, We even popped people onto the map. So you can see clusters. I mean, typically you would imagine, people are filling out things. I mean, it's just the population centers.
I was mostly curious because I think over here in West Virginia, we actually have a bank called Mountain Bank, and I would be like,
oh,
so I recognize that.
That's funny. That's funny. No, we chose Mountain Bank. We thought it wasn't a bank. So we just yeah.
Well, it looks like you have one person maybe from West Virginia, so they might be slightly confused, but I think it's a pretty small local bank.
Yeah, so our footprint is in like the 19 Western states. Mainly our main customers come from California, like California, Colorado, like basically like Sacramento, the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Denver, right? That's like our main bread and butter of our customers, and people most likely the highest social identities around being green. So that's how we're taking like that's where we're trying to mainly focus our marketing stuff. But I mean, you're going to get people who live in Idaho or Wyoming or Utah that have the same sort of things, even though they might be Republican states. But that's why I think it's important to measure the right variables, and what's great, and this is what, I'll just repeat this again and again and again. What's so important about going to grad school is, or maybe not important about going to grad school, but like understanding that if you take theory, good research starts with good theory. Then you say, this is the truth of the world. What should we then be able to go test based on this theory, right? And this is what we're doing at the bank, right? It's like, okay, social identity theory says this. How can we go implement that, right? Like cognitive dissonance theory says this. We should be able to go find it or manipulate it in these particular ways. And then we find the results we expect, and we go, great, we're tapping into those sort of psychological constructs.
Have you studied implicit bias theory as well? We recently were discussing this in our class, and how typically if you're more right-leaning, more conservative, you're more likely to have certain values matter more to yourself rather than liberals. I'm sure you've seen this in your research.
Yeah, that definitely is the case, right? So like, I don't know, that's not like my area of expertise, but I've definitely been to many talks and come across that stuff where I don't remember all the specific variables, but there's definitely, in a sense, that's what like sort of pulls those groups apart a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, I think the human values aspect can also figure in that sort of a question or conversation about what drives and what are the correlations between affiliation, political affiliation, and beliefs and implicit biases.
Totally. Yeah. And political affiliation, I mean, we basically have two parties, right? And so you have to like fit yourself into one of a dichotomous category, right? And there's going to be a lot more variability across each of those things. And we see that politically going on right now. Like the spectrum is being pulled apart, right? Those two groups' mean attitudes are being pulled apart from each other, and the tails are less overlapping, and thus like there's no compromise happening and stuff like that. So, but if you can hit on other things, so like you can hit Republicans, be like, hey, this is the green thing to do. We should be thinking about and categorizing ourselves not as Democrats and Republicans by like our environmental social identity, right? Our green identity. Like, who has the green identity in the room? Like, regardless of political affiliation, right? Like, that is going to be a useful way to, right? When we think about persuasion, we have to think about how we are framing the message and how we're making salient certain social identities rather than others. And so, and that's what this research shows, or just another example of that.
I'm Aaron Moss. I work at CloudResearch, and today I'll be presenting some data on this question of whether or not it's ethical to use Mechanical Turk for behavioral research. So to start off with a little bit of background that many people may be familiar with, but in case some people are not, Mechanical Turk is a microtask marketplace that was created by Amazon in 2005. And the idea behind this marketplace is that it puts one group of people who are looking to have tasks or surveys or some small jobs completed in touch with another group of people who are willing to complete those tasks. And this marketplace is also really premised on the idea of human intelligence, that it requires a thoughtful human mind in order to complete the types of tasks and jobs that are posted. on Mechanical Turk. So Mechanical Turk kind of developed under the radar for a couple of years. Around 2010 or 2011, academic researchers published some papers showing that you could gather high quality data. And from there was really just an explosion in the number of online studies. This corresponded with developments in the tools and the technology for kind of carrying out online studies. But for most academic researchers, Mechanical Turk was really at the heart of this online revolution. And the reasons for that are very clear today, that gathering data online is much faster than bringing people into the laboratory. And Mechanical Turk offered access to a more diverse pool of people than was available in an undergraduate subject pool, or sometimes even in the local community. So to just give you kind of one view of Mechanical Turk at the time, Susan Fisk, a very well-known social psychologist, was interviewed by PBS in 2015, asked about her lab's use of the platform. And she said, from my perspective, as a social psychologist, this is so much better than running studies on college students. People on Mechanical Turk are way more representative of the American people. Right, so this is just one view, but it helps kind of characterize the positivity and the excitement that people had about Mechanical Turk. If you had a chance to attend Jesse Chandler's keynote address earlier today, you heard a lot more about that kind of the early promises, the expectations that people brought to the platform. And if you didn't have a chance to check that out, there'll be a recorded video of it. It was a really good talk. So it was nice to kind of think about how far Mechanical Turk has come, and I highly recommend that. Right, so there was some positivity and excitement, but over the next couple of years, researchers really had a chance to kind of poke and prod and explore Mechanical Turk. One benefit of all the attention that was directed to Mechanical Turk is that researchers learned a lot about the platform and its strengths and weaknesses. And some of the criticisms that began to emerge and then kind of solidified really hit on three different points. The first was concern that participants on Mechanical Turk may be financially vulnerable, that these might be people who have few other options for work or to earn money, and so they might be turning to Mechanical Turk, really trying to earn money and primarily support themselves. The second concern was that requesters may treat workers in negative ways, that there's a possibility that participants on the platform might be being abused. And then a third concern, which is related to the first two, was really that there's a prevalent high number of tasks that really just don't pay a lot of money on Mechanical Turk. And so there's concern that many tasks pay so little that it makes the platform unethical. So to dig into each of these concerns a little bit more, understand where they really come from, some of the earliest evidence that a large portion of people in Mechanical Turk might be relying on it as their primary source of income came from some surveys that found about a fifth of people were reporting that Mechanical Turk was their primary source of income. That concern was then later amplified by interviews that were conducted both by academic researchers and journalists writing popular press articles. In these interviews, some workers expressed the view that there were not other options for work in their local community, so they were really turning to Mechanical Turk to try to make ends meet. And that was popularized in some popular articles, like one published in The Atlantic that described Mechanical Turk as a new form of a poorly paid hell. And by the time the New York Times looked into Mechanical Turk in 2019, this characterization of Mechanical Turk, that the majority of people on the platform are there because they struggle to find work elsewhere, perhaps they have disabilities that make working outside of the home difficult, it really became taken as fact. And the writer of this article stated that it really gave the sense that this is the characterization of why most people are Mechanical Turk. And so it really kind of became a hardened view of Mechanical Turk. Concerns about abuse really stem from one, structural imbalance in power that Mechanical Turk has really built into the platform. So requesters, the people who post tasks, have the power to decide whether or not the tasks that workers submit have been done to their level of satisfaction. If so, they approve the work and the worker gets paid. If not, they reject the work, and not only does the worker not get paid, but their reputation on the platform suffers. So the aim of this power imbalance was to prevent fraud, to give people an incentive for submitting high quality work. But it also certainly opens up the door for the possibility of abuse. And in some of the popular press articles that I mentioned, workers have stated that they think that there might be requesters who reject a certain percentage of submissions, regardless of the quality of those submissions, just as a way to cover their Mechanical Turk costs. So there's certainly concerns about the possibility for abuse. And the second source of concern really comes from the content of tasks. So some tech companies have been known to post content moderation tasks that might ask people to look at gruesome or offensive images, disturbing sort of content, to make decisions about whether or not that violates the terms of service of a platform. And then there's at least some suggestion that the content of academic surveys might be disturbing to people. So surveys might ask people to relive certain traumatic experiences, to induce people into certain negative moods. There's at least a little bit of suggestion that some of the content of academic surveys might expose people to really kind of undesirable circumstances. All right, and then the third concern about Mechanical Turk really centers around pay. So one study that's a working paper used a data-driven approach to kind of estimate wages. They had different workers install a browser plugin that then tracked how much time people spent on Mechanical Turk and how much they were paid for those tasks. Based on this data, the researchers estimated that the median wage was around $2 per hour. This paper really grew legs. It's been heavily cited, heavily talked about. It even appeared in a segment of the TV show Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, and a series that was criticizing gig economy platforms for their pay practices. I think if you read this paper, there are a few question marks about it personally, so that there's no description of who these workers were, whether or not they were people who were very experienced or maybe people who are brand new to the platform. There's kind of surprisingly just no demographic description of them whatsoever. And perhaps more importantly, that estimate also exists out there alongside estimates from organizations like Pew and the International Labor Office, where workers self-report wages closer to $5 an hour. And then some worker-run sites of very active, very engaged people on the platform self-report that their members have earnings over $20 an hour. So there's a lot of discrepancy in the pay and understanding what people earn on Mechanical Turk, but it's certainly not hard to look at Mechanical Turk and find lots of low-paying tasks listed on the platform. So from our perspective, as a research team at CloudResearch, there are a few problems with this existing data and using it to really characterize all of Mechanical Turk. The first is that a lot of these samples are relatively small, so they might be surveys done with a few hundred participants, or in some cases, a few thousand. Some of the data is also anecdotal, coming from useful and important interviews with participants, but these might not be necessarily representative. And this concern is really amplified when you consider how Mechanical Turk operates. So when a requester posts a task, unless they do something to control the composition of who can take that task, it's open to workers on a first come, first served basis. And that means that more active and more engaged people are the most likely to kind of end up in a survey or in a study to begin with. And so this creates a built-in mechanism of self-selection bias. The second issue with some of this existing data, or I should also just say, it leads to this issue of self-selection bias, and that's not exactly the type of sampling approach that you might want to use when characterizing the entire platform. It leads to this possibility of bias in kind of your estimates and how you describe the platform. The second concern is that while we certainly know that people have negative experiences on Mechanical Turk, some of the popular press articles that have really detailed these in fine detail don't give us a good sense of context. How often do these happen? Is it something that people experience on the platform every day? Is it relatively infrequent? A lot of these existing sources of information don't do a good job of providing that context. And then finally, when it comes to wages on Mechanical Turk, it's just incredibly difficult to really figure out how much it is that people are making. So it's this microtask platform where people work may come irregularly. Two people who accept the same survey or the same task are unlikely to make the same amount of money unless they complete it in exactly the same amount of time. So there are just a lot of factors that make calculating something like an hourly wage incredibly difficult on the platform. So in the research that I'm going to share here, our team was really interested in a lot of the conversation about Mechanical Turk and ethics. And the goal of our surveys is really try to get a better answer to some of these questions by using a representative sampling approach, so a probability-based sampling approach. And this was made possible for us because we have a database that records activity from all the studies that are run through CloudResearch. So it captures metadata, and we're able to use that in a way that we'll talk about as a kind of a sampling frame, which most other researchers don't have available to them. And with our representative sampling approach, we were interested in asking people questions about their financial status, their views of Mechanical Turk, how often they had these negative experiences, and some questions about wages. So the way we went about conducting our survey, first of all, we queried our database for everyone who had completed at least one hit over a period of 2 months in late 2019. This yielded a list of over 43,000 worker IDs. And then we randomly sampled from this list while stratifying by a person's level of experience. So everyone in our sampling frame had an equal probability of being a participant within our study. We randomly selected people, sent them an email invitation to our survey, and then gathered our responses. We conducted 2 surveys, both of them with just over 2,000 participants. In the first survey, we were interested in broadly people's views of Mechanical Turk. And in the second one, we asked just a handful of questions, much more narrowly focused on perceptions of fairness and experiences on the platform. So what you can see here is an outline of our sampling approach. At the time, our database contained about 250,000 worker IDs, and that was kind of all time. That number today is up over 350,000, but from that population, right, we queried people who were active over a period of 2 months and had a list of 43,274 people. From there, we then stratified our sample based on level of experience. So we had a proportion of participants who were very active, people who had been engaged on the platform for a long time and had completed more than 5,000 hits. And that ranged all the way down to our lowest strata, which were people who were really brand new to the platform. They had completed less than 100 hits. We sampled from each of these 4 groups in proportion to the share of the MTurk population. And so what that means is about 35% of people on Mechanical Turk are relatively new. They have less than 100 hits completed. And we allowed that group to represent 35% of our overall sample. So what you can see and kind of the towards the bottom there is the response rates that we got across these different groups. They range from about 57% in the very active, kind of more experienced people down to a low of about 11%. We knew that this was likely to happen, that there would be differences in response rates. That was part of the reason for stratifying our sample to begin with, to make sure that we represented people all along this spectrum of experience. And also just for context, it's worth noting that in random digit phone dialing, which is often the gold standard for things like political polling, public opinion, right? Response rates are usually around 2 or 3%. At peak election time, they fall below 1%. So in all of the groups in our survey, we're really orders of magnitude higher than what's considered the gold standard for things like public polling. So to show you some of our results, first of all, the first question we asked people was just, how do you view Mechanical Turk? Do you use it as a full-time job? Do you see it as a part-time job? Or is it something that you do in your leisure time in order to make extra money? And what you can see is overall, about 56% of our sample characterized Mechanical Turk as a form of paid leisure, something that they do to earn money while they're at home or not doing anything else that's particularly profitable. Sometimes people like to just have an opportunity to earn money on the internet. Over a third of people in our survey reported that they view Mechanical Turk as a form of part-time work, and about 7.5% of people said they view it as a form of full-time work. What you can see in the figure is how these numbers moved around based on the 4 groups that we stratified our sample on based on worker experience level. And you can see, as you would expect, that as experience on the platform goes up, the percentage of people who say Mechanical Turk is a form of full-time work goes up. But even in the most experienced group, about 36% of people are telling us that they see it as a form of paid leisure. And so just as a contrast to kind of the conversation about Mechanical Turk, this is a point of departure that I don't think the conversation currently characterizes. Room that about 56% of people overall see it as a form of paid leisure, or even some of the most active and experienced people also see it as a form of paid leisure. So next, we wanted to ask people about their financial situation. We took some questions from Gallup, which does polling with nationally representative samples of the US population. And this was a point of comparison. So we were able to plot our data next to nationally representative data within the US. And what you can see here is that there's a pretty good distribution that matches. People on Mechanical Turk describe their financial situation with these answer options similarly to people in the US population, except for there are more people in the US population who describe their situation as excellent than there are on Mechanical Turk. When we ask a more specific question about people's household finances, we see some more evidence of more financial hardship on Mechanical Turk, so a little bit more negative impression of people's finances. So there are more people who on Mechanical Turk who say that they're running into debt. More people in the US population say that they're saving a lot. But in a lot of cases, these differences are within 5 or fewer percentage points. So this still doesn't represent a dramatic departure from the US population, but certainly more evidence of a financial hardship here when we ask about household finances. The next question we asked people was how stressful they find completing tasks on Mechanical Turk. And what you can see with the lighter gray bars is that over 90% of people are either completely or somewhat satisfied with the amount of stress that completing tasks entails. In the US workforce, there are more people who describe being dissatisfied or completely dissatisfied with their work experiences. This kind of makes sense. People on Mechanical Turk are at home or in the environment of their choosing. They get to choose the hours that they spend on the platform, whereas people in the US workforce are subjected to a much wider range of work conditions, things that might be much more stressful. So we would kind of expect to see more evidence of stress in the US workforce, but this is one point of comparison. We asked people several questions about wages within our survey. I only have time to share the data from one here. So we asked people, in your estimate, how much can people earn on Mechanical Turk per hour? We asked how much people can earn rather than directly asking people how much they do earn, because these forms of self-report have been criticized in the past. People may not have a good way of tracking the time that they spend. They may not really be very good at computing kind of their hourly wages. So what you can see in this figure is along the x-axis, we have characterized people based on how they view the platform. So people who say Mechanical Turk is a form of a full-time job report that it's possible that people can earn over $25 per hour. People who characterize Mechanical Turk as a part-time job or as a form of paid leisure are saying it's possible to earn something closer to $8 or $9 an hour. And then just as a kind of another data point, we plotted average hourly earnings with all of the data in our CloudResearch database from 2015 to 2019 in half-year increments. So this is from hundreds of thousands of workers who collectively completed about 14 million hits overall. And what you can see is that average hourly earnings here go up from a low of about 548 in late 2015 up to over 685 per hour in 2019. And so this may be as a result of market forces. It might be a result of academic researchers having conversations and raising wages, but this also kind of is just something to pair with the data from workers in our survey. So to summarize our first survey, we see that our data do not offer strong support for some of the criticisms raised in Mechanical Turk. I didn't have time to break it out here, but in the supplement that we have to this paper, we show how the numbers, what the numbers look like for each of the 4 groups in our sampling, stratified sampling approach. And there's a little bit of variability across the groups, but the numbers are, for the most part, relatively stable. And it's not like the criticisms of Mechanical Turk have no basis in reality, or that workers don't express dissatisfaction. We do see people saying things like they feel underpaid for the tasks that they do. The task could pay more. People mention some other problems and issues with the platform, but we think that our data show a discrepancy kind of between the way people have talked about Mechanical Turk and what the reality of the platform might be. There's one important limitation to this survey, is that we didn't ask a lot of questions to really characterize people's experiences of the platform. And so that's what we tried to do in our second survey. So we had essentially the same sampling procedure as study 1, and we got basically the same response rates. In this survey, we asked people just a much more narrow set of questions, 5 or 6 questions, asking about their perceptions of fairness on the platform and the types of experiences that they have. So what you can see in this figure is we asked people generally how fair and honest do you perceive requesters on Mechanical Turk, and generally how fair and honest do you think employers outside of Mechanical Turk are. And what you can see here across all the groups that all the different levels of worker experience, we find evidence that participants are saying there are more fair and honest requesters on Mechanical Turk than there are employers outside of Mechanical Turk. In this table, you can see we ask people a number of questions like how many hours do they spend on the platform per week? What percentage of hits do they have that are rejected? What percentage of hits contain disturbing content? You can see both means and medians represented here. Looking at the median numbers, people report spending about 5 hours per week on the platform. The percentage of hits that they have rejected and the ones that contain disturbing content are down around 1%. An interesting kind of tidbit is that when we initially posted this survey, we gave people a sliding answer scale that moved from 0 to 100 in full number increments. We had to then change that because a number of participants reached out to us and said that actually the most accurate answer for the percentage of hits they have rejected is something less than 1%. So we need to give people the option to answer with fractions of a percentage. And somewhat interestingly, when we ask people what percentage of the rejections that they receive are unfair, people are telling us that actually the majority of the time when they receive a rejection, they actually perceive it as fair. So only about 36% of the time on average do people perceive it as unfair. The final question that we asked people was just to characterize how often they have different upsetting events on the platform. You can see here that over 65% of people are telling us that almost never do they have these upsetting events, and about 95% of the sample here is saying either half the days that they are on Mechanical Turk or less do they have upsetting experiences. So to summarize our second survey, people on Mechanical Turk seem to report that requesters are largely fair and honest, and more fair and honest than employers outside of Mechanical Turk. People tell us that they spend about 8 hours per week on the platform on average. A median is closer to 5. And it looks like when people characterize what percentage of hits they have that are rejected or contain disturbing content, these events are relatively infrequent. So our survey has limitations the way that all research does. One that reviewers have brought up when we've submitted this for review is the possibility of non-response. So there's a different response rate across the groups that we stratified our sample on. And there's a possibility that the people who responded to the survey are different than those who did not. In the supplement to this paper, we do a demographic analysis showing the demographics of who responded and how that compares to people who were invited but didn't respond, and also to our overall sampling frame. We don't see differences in the demographics, but of course, there's a possibility that it's a variable that we haven't measured or that we don't have data on that differs between these two groups. So the possibility of non-response is always something that's a possibility. And some reviewers have also criticized our decision to stratify the sample. So the idea here is that if you want to understand the platform, it's probably better to understand and oversample people who are very active. Those are the people who are completing the majority of the tasks. And those are the people who have the majority of the experience. In some regards, this is a fair criticism. We do have a probability sampling of people with more experience in our in this survey. And so there's room for a conversation about what the best way to represent people's experiences on the platform are. So we think some of the implications of this research are that it seems to us from this data that the way people currently characterize and talk about Mechanical Turk is out of step or disproportionate to what the data would support. And we think that the data that we've gathered are things that researchers who plan studies and IRBs who evaluate those studies would be interested in. It's important to know how often people have different negative experiences and how people are using the platform. Of course, the data that we've gathered, not the final word on this, we see this is really just contributing to an ongoing conversation. So our research team approaches Mechanical Turk with maybe perhaps some assumptions, a certain background knowledge that not all researchers may share. And we're aware of the possibility for our own biases in this regard. So we just see our data as contributing to a conversation. but not the final word on something like the ethics of using this platform. So a couple of recommendations for how researchers can ensure that the research they conduct is in kind of line with norms for treating people well, not only from a research perspective, but using Mechanical Turk. One, it's important to kind of aim for the payment norms on the platform. So there's some existing norms about how much tasks should pay, both based on their length and the types of tasks that people are being asked to engage in. Doing your best to kind of adhere to those norms is good. We think that it's important to strive to treat people with respect and to have positive interactions, even though these interactions are being mediated through technology. We write about things like this in the ethics chapter that we have in our book, that it's best to try to treat people the same way that you would as if they were in the laboratory. And then one thing that I really think doesn't get talked about nearly enough is ensuring that we're designing user-friendly tasks. So there are some people on Mechanical Turk who are trying to use it for the majority of their income. And for these people, having instructions that don't make sense, links that don't work, any kind of frustrating experiences, I'm sure are more difficult to deal with than the people who are just casually using the platform. And so it's really incumbent on researchers to make sure that things are user-friendly and as clear and easy as possible. And that can only also lead to better data quality within our studies. So I just want to thank the other folks on the CloudResearch team who have contributed to this research. And I'll go ahead and stop and pause for some questions.
Aaron, it looks like there's a question from Jesse Chandler in the chat. His question is, when making claims about the pool as a whole, have you thought about weighting your responses so the strata are proportionate to the pool as a whole?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in our initial sampling approach, we stratified the sample to try to sample people in proportion to match those, right? So people with less than 100 hits completed, again, are about 35% of the population. We tried to make sure our sample had about 35% of the population in that group. The sampling approach didn't, perfectly represent that. And so in our latest revisions to this paper, we do this weighting where if there's any variation between what we actually sampled and the kind of proportion of the pool as a whole, we do this weighting. I'm not sure if, actually, I think this data is updated. So in our latest version of this paper, right, going through the review process, we do this weighting. And I think the numbers in this presentation also reflect that weighting.
Okay, question from Laurel Cook. Did you also collect open response data in either study?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been some time since I've looked at the data. We collected some of this back in 2019 and then early in 2020, and a lot has happened in life and the world since then. So I believe we did have some open-ended questions asking people some different things where they could respond. Do you remember at all, Labe? I'm pretty sure we had a few, but open-ended responses were kind of not the primary focus. We were trying to get more quantitative data, but certainly allowing people kind of open-ended responding is a rich source of getting people's opinions. But do you have any memory of open-ended responses?
I mean, we definitely collected open-ended responses, but it was kind of exploratory, and the goal was just to, potentially gain some insights. But we never intended to formally analyze that data. So it's there, but I'm not sure if there's any kind of top-level summary that I'm able to provide off the top of my head, except that nothing that we saw in the open-ended data really sort of contradicted the kind of conclusions you would get through the other data, except that of course it's a much richer source of people's experiences. So it's always interesting to look at that.
Yeah, and you saying exploratory reminded me that so with this project, like a lot of others, we do our best to be open and transparent about what we're doing. So we did like pre-register our materials it was difficult to pre-register exact hypotheses because we're looking at like point estimates. So, you know, we didn't have a sense of the exact percentage of people who would say different things, but we did pre-register kind of our materials and what we were doing in this case. And that's something we strive to do. Our data are open. So just kind of triggered that as a thought in my mind. Looks like there's another question asking about payment amount and how it affects data quality. So there's some pretty dated papers at this point showing that back in like 2015, 2016, the amount of money that you offered for a task didn't really affect data quality when you're looking at things like reliability estimates, some other kind of like more basic, I think, measures of quality. What we do know is that when you pay kind of below the norms, your data will collect more slowly, that it takes longer to get your full sample. Things change quickly on Mechanical Turk. I think a lot of people have been interested in whether or not some of those papers still hold up. I would personally venture to guess that for things like survey questions, they do hold up, that you can still collect high quality data if you're below kind of the platform norms for payment, if you're collecting kind of survey response data. But if you're asking people to do more engaging or challenging tasks, things where they have to write, things where they have to be creative, engage in something with someone else, you know, anything that goes beyond kind of just answering survey questions, I think then you're more likely to see perhaps some data quality issues. We certainly know that the more engaging a task is, the more that you pay for it, the more people are willing to engage in it. So Leib, you're the author of one of these papers. I don't know if you have any comments you want to share about payment and data quality.
I mean, not anything different that what you've already said. We did look at this question a bunch of years back, and it was the case that you can pay people, 2 cents or $1 for doing the same, 3-4 minute survey, and the reliabilities would be pretty much identical. However, at the same time, there were studies also now probably about 6-7 years ago that showed, as Aaron was saying, that creativity, any kind of effort, any kind of like open-ended responses, anything that involves more kind of work, people are just not going to do a good job if you don't pay them for that time. And there's a particular study that I'm thinking of. I can't remember the authors. It was actually they were from. Interestingly enough, it was a study out of NYU Law School, and they were doing something really interesting about patent law and how creativity is affected by rewards. And one of the authors was Ginny Frommer, and I know that, but I don't remember who the other authors were. And what they showed was that there was this really interesting cognitive task, like creative task that they used, and they showed that like if you give people $1 bonus, they manipulated that experimentally, and it turned out that giving people a $1 bonus had a huge effect on task performance in this particular case. And it was a task where people had to exert some effort and be creative in order to solve. And so I think that that's likely still true. Like people will be willing to do some very basic things without getting paid much, but they're not going to exert too much effort unless you really compensate them well.
Yeah, and it looks like, sorry, I lost the chat, but someone shared a new paper in the chat about incentivizing high quality work, and so people might be interested in sharing, checking that out. And thanks for dropping that into the chat.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly. So Winter Mason and Sid Surrey published a paper early on that's been ridiculously cited, where they were sort of showing in the particular context of their study that paying more didn't lead to higher quality, and that's most what everyone still cites. But this is later work by Sid and some other people. I think this was a paper award also back in 2015, where they showed that essentially this initial study you didn't have to do that much effort, and for these tasks that were more effortful, then higher pay was leading to different quality, just in the ways that you guys are talking about. So this is sort of the best one that I know sort of to point people to when they talk about this. But typically everything I hear about quality is and versus latency of uptake on tasks and everything is consistent with what you're saying.